Today we're going to cover the JavaScript array methods every and some. We'll cover what they're primarily used for, what's their main purpose. We'll talk about what their function signatures look like. Next, we'll cover when they can end iteration early, which they do in some cases. And lastly, we'll cover how they behave with empty arrays. So the main purpose of the every and some methods are to determine if every element, that's for the every method, or at least one element in an array, that's for some, pass a particular constraint. And what's the constraint? Well, the constraint is provided by the callback function that we provide. So, for example here, one common use case is to determine if, let's start with every, to determine if every element in an array is, let's say, above or below some threshold. So here we have an array of numbers, and our callback, our predicate function, is checking if each of those numbers is below the number 10. So this is our predicate function. What's it doing? It's checking if each number is below 10. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are all below 10. So we would expect return value to be true, and then when we log that, we do see that return value is true. Now, similarly, if we replace this with, let's say, some, and so now we're checking if the number is less than 2, that's our predicate, but remember here that we're using some. And what some checks for is if at least one of the values in the array passes the constraint provided by our predicate. So what's the constraint? Is number less than 2? For all of these numbers, are any of them less than 2? Well, yes, 1 is less than 2. So again, we would expect to see true here, which is indeed what we get. So let's take a look at the function signature of some in this case. So if we hover our mouse over some here, we get this very useful VS Code pop-up. And here we can see that some, the first parameter, is a predicate function. And that predicate function itself has 3 parameters. The value that we're iterating over, its index in the array, and then the array itself. Now, if we look at the return value of this predicate function, we see unknown. So technically, the predicate functions of every and some, they only need to return a truthy or falsy value. As in, the thing that you return, the JavaScript runtime converts that to a true or false value. In my opinion, you want to be careful, you want to be more explicit about the thing you're returning. So say, for example, that we didn't want to check that the number was less than 2, all we wanted to do was check that the number is truthy. We could do something like that, maybe, except that here we're forgetting that 0 is a falsy value. And so watch what happens if we do this. We do indeed get our true value from every. However, if we add in the 0 and then we run this, we get false here. So a neat thing about every and some is that if they can, they will end the iteration early. So here we have an array of numbers, and we're checking if each one is less than 10, which in this case it is. So we would expect our return value to be true, and we would get a log for each of those numbers. So we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then our return value of true. But what's going to happen if we say, is every number less than 2? Well, we can see that every number is not less than 2. It has several numbers that are not less than 2. But what's going to happen with this console log? How many times is that log going to fire? Let's find out. Notice that we only get the log firing for the elements at the first 2 indices, so 1 and 2, and then we get return value false. So this demonstrates that the every method will end iteration early if it can. So as in the first time the predicate, again, that's this function that we pass to every, the first time that that returns a falsy value, every will stop iteration and immediately return false. Now, in a similar way, for some, if the value is true for any of those, the first time that the predicate returns a truthy value, it will stop iteration and it will return true, right? So the log only fired for the iteration on this element, and it said, oh, that is less than true. We have found at least one element that passes the constraint provided by our callback, so we can return true. Now, conversely, if all of the times this predicate is invoked, if it returns false each time for some, that means it literally has to check through all of the elements in the array and says, do you pass the predicate? Oh, you don't. Okay, do you? You don't. Do you? Oh, you don't. Okay, I checked all of them. None of them pass that constraint, so that means not greater than or equal to 1 passes, which means all of them failed, so we get the return value false. Now, in all of our examples so far, we've been using numbers, and array and sum absolutely work on arrays with more than just numbers. For example, here we have an array of objects, right, with a name, which is a string property. And notice here that we're checking to see if the person.name is Christian for every element, and so our expectation is this would be false because it is not Christian for each of the name properties for every element. And we can do a similar thing with sum. Here we're checking if at least one of the objects has a name property of Christian, and so we would expect to see true here, which is indeed what we get. Now, what's going to happen with an empty array? So let's say we have something like this. We have an empty array, and our predicate function is returning true. What do we think is going to happen? Let's go take a look. We get true. What about if we always return false from our predicate function on an empty array for every? We still get true. So for every, when it's iterating on an empty array, regardless of what the predicate function returns, whether a truthy value or a falsy value, every, its return value will always be true. So conceptually, this is sort of like the for all quantifier from maths. So again, for every on an empty array, always returns true. Now, sum is actually a little different. So for sum, if we run this, what do we expect to get? We get false. What about if we flip what the predicate returns? So here, we still get false. For sum, regardless of what the predicate returns, when sum runs on an empty array, it always returns false. Now, conceptually, this is sort of like the sum or there exists quantifier from maths. So again, for sum on an empty array, regardless of the predicate, it will always return false. So for empty arrays, the behavior of sum and every is opposite. So sum always returns false, and every always returns true for empty arrays. All right, so that's it for today's introduction to the every and sum methods. Make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon so you get notified when there's new videos. Make sure to comment with what you want me to cover next and tell a friend too. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye!